All right, we're going to have a look here through how this scenario might unfold with the fuel shortages. So here's a conversation with DeepSeek. What happens if fuel supplies do not meet demand? Well, we're already starting to see we might get price increases, fuel rationing, supply chain disruptions, economic slowdown, black market and hoarding, releasing of strategic reserves, and this has all already happened. So let's think about where this is going to go. And in going through this conversation, we're going to see how this could unfold over the coming months, really. And we're going to move from how it impacts not just fuel, but food supplies, society, and government. So as the problem of fuel shortages gets further, we're going to, and we've already seen some of this, voluntary conservation, whereby the government, makes suggestions for people to not drive unnecessarily, encourages them to use public transport. Here in Melbourne, we've had free public transport introduced. Removing excess weight from the vehicles. DeepSeek's just pulling this from on the web, so it's going to pick up the things that have been happening. However, if this is not sufficient, then mandatory controls are activated. So there's a principle here to protect essential services. And it turns out there's an act already in place since 1984 for the government to do this. We'll get to that in a minute. All right, so who's going to get priority? In Australia, it's emergency services. Yeah. Actually, food production is not considered yet critical, and that's something that farmers have been pushing to change. But yeah, I guess you're going to find that ultimately the Australian system is based around preserving emergency services in a real emergency. Yep. But in the meanwhile, sort of higher level or more fundamental supply chains will be protected. So yeah, food distribution, supermarket deliveries, things like that. Whereas other things might be considered expendable. I'm not sure what that might be, but I'm sure that there are things that the government will decide aren't critical, just as we saw in COVID. All right. So when it comes to rationing, if there is rationing, how could that be done? We could be doing things like a QR code linked to a central database. That's what's been done in Bangladesh to I guess you get given a sort of token for a certain amount of fuel, and you need to get that approved when you buy it. That doesn't seem to be the system that's likely to happen in Australia. The old odd even license plate scheme. I remember this from the 70s, where one day you could go, with basically alternate days you could buy fuel. But that's a bit of a indiscriminate use of fuel. It doesn't sort of prioritise certain uses. And then we also have releasing oil from strategic reserves and managing stockholds. That's already happening. So that's not something that's going to happen in the future. It's happened already. All right. So if they need to batten down the hatches in terms of rationing, then we need, as this says, laws which have teeth, and governments are updating legislation to include strong enforcement to protect supply chains and penalise bad actors. So Australia is updating its 30-year-old laws to allow rationing to be declared for 90-day periods. And that can be done to make that easier. It used to be needing parliamentary approval every 7 days. So governments are preparing for this quietly behind the scenes. So they can have in South Australia rationing for 90-day periods, which will just be renewed as needed. How that rationing looks, we don't know. We'll get to that in a minute. All right. And then there are strong enforcements and penalties, new laws for targeting hoarding, on-the-spot fine for breaching purchase limits, in taking any fuel that you obtained illegally, and 3 years in prison for individuals who assault, threaten or intimidate fuel station workers or delivery drivers. This one, 3 years in prison for individuals who assault, threaten and intimidate fuel station workers, implies they're anticipating a lot of stress at the pumps. We're talking queues. We're talking you can only get 20 litres or something. You can't fill containers. Bad luck if you want to mow your lawn or something, I suppose. And people getting cranky with each other and cranky with the fuel attendants. So be prepared perhaps for that. So governments view fuel scale rationing as a last resort, only after all other measures, I guess voluntary ones, have failed. So they want people to cooperate as much as possible. Okay, so rationing is obviously not currently happening, but I've talked about the fact that in South Australia they're prepared for it. We have the potential of on-the-spot fines for breaching whatever laws they bring in. We don't know quite how the rationing is going to take place. And fines for people who are, hoarding or overcharging or doing things like that. All right. So when would rationing come in? If the National Fuel Security Plan escalates to level 4. So let's come to what level 4 is later. But basically what's happening here is one possible system is a simple per transaction cap. So this is for the federal law. Now we're going to talk about this because this federal law looks like it's not going to work. But the federal law would be a simple, because there is the act that currently sits there since 1984 that can be used to manage fuel is a federal act designed to get cooperation among the states. But as we saw during COVID, we had a federal law for biosecurity that wasn't implemented. What we got was state-by-state responses. And that may well happen in this situation. And this is a scenario that gets played out. In fact, it is happening. All right. So basically, you would be limited to maybe $40 a purchase. As prices go up, you get less fuel anyway. So that kind of naturally restricts supply as supply gets less and less. Okay. So there might be exemptions. So that would be ambulance, police, firefighters, taxis. Also, road freight and waste collection might be considered essential users. So there would be exemption categories if they did bring in sort of a flat cap. We talked about the fact that you could get on-the-spot fines, seizure of your fuel, and the fines would apply to the owner of a vehicle, so they don't have to track down who was buying it. It's nice and easy for them. All right. So the answer is that this is all based on, a deterrence, really. So there's nothing to stop you going from pump to pump to pump, from service station to service station. But they're anticipating that that's not going to be practical anyway in this scenario because there'll be such long queues. You'll be sitting there all day. So that's how they're going to deal with station hopping, threatening you with fines for breaking the rules, even though they probably can't actively enforce them, and just the impracticalities of sitting in queues waiting to get fuel if this actually happens. So that's the alternative to the centralized QR code approach, which if they wanted to implement, they better do that pretty quickly because that would need to be a federally organized, and it looks like the federal system is gonna be fall apart. Okay, all right. So, so it's easier to do deterrence. It's easier to say, look, we're going to have harsh fines and random checks, rather than to implement some sort of new IT system with QR codes and work out who the drivers are and get all the drivers from Victoria and classify them according to whether they're essential services or not. The QR code, I think, is not going to happen. It could, but the probability is low. All right. So All right, so what happens if the shortages become so severe that stronger enforcement becomes necessary? So we're moving beyond just threatening people with fines towards and limiting how much you buy. We're moving towards direct control of the supply chain. So this is more of a command and control approach, where we have a minister who directs fuel movement, prohibits supply to non-essential users, and overrides state laws and compels companies to provide data. So he's going to tell them where to take the fuel. It's going to be completely restricted to emergency services and potentially farmers, although that's not in the legislation yet. But all right, so that act, that federal one, is the Liquid Fuel Emergency Act 1984. It's never been used before, but in theory, it allows the federal government to take control of the energy, fuel, the petrol system and diesel system. All right, but what's actually happening? That is that states aren't waiting for that. So the Western Australia Premier is threatening the major fuel suppliers that they need to hand over all the data on their fuel holdings and supply plans. All right, so that's states starting to try and take control. All right, what this might mean, if escalation comes in, fines become prison time. Pumps don't shut off. You're told where you can buy fuel and how much the station is allowed to sell. You get police raids on individuals suspected of stockpiling fuel, and maybe even particularly in the farming regions or in industrial regions, inspectors going from site to site looking for hoards. So I think that's entirely possible. All right, I think this is. Would they try and directly control travel? Here in Victoria, we had the Ring of Steel, where you couldn't leave Melbourne. So DeepSeek thinks that that's unlikely, because you've got two different problems. One was to stop the spread of a virus, and legally it's harder to stop people travelling. The act is different. So what you're trying to control is different. You're trying to control the use of a resource, not the spread of a virus. And of course, it's complicated by the fact that people have EVs. So, you might say we want to restrict travel to save fuel, but then you wouldn't be able to. You can't restrict EVs. So, either you have to filter out the EVs or deal with it somehow. It maybe gets a bit too complicated to say we're going to restrict travel, or maybe you don't need to. If you restrict supply, you do restrict travel. So probably the easier thing to target is the supply. All right, but what they can do, the Act allows a minister to regulate or prohibit the supply of fuel. The Act is based around the supply, not drivers. So they can tell service stations what they can and can't do, or trucking companies to where they must go. But they can't sort of force you to stay inside your suburbs, not directly anyway. All right, so as the restrictions get better, the essential users comes down to just emergency services, food logistics, as in deliveries to your supermarkets, healthcare and public transport. Okay, everyone else would be cut off from controlled supply chains. All right, so in the extreme case, retail stations are told to reserve their entire supply for pre-approved bulk customers, like the government or food distributors. The pump's simply not available to the general public. All right, the minister can order a company in one state to physically move the stock to another state. This is something that's gonna be a problem for the federal powers, and they can seize fuel that has been hoarded or distributed illegally. All right. So, in theory, the Commonwealth or the federal law should override the state law. But as we saw during COVID, the federal laws were just ignored. The Biosecurity Act, but under the Constitution, the federal law should override the state law. But I guess there's a question about whether this federal law really even sits within the responsibilities of federal government, which we'll come to later. All right. Okay. So even if you've got an EV, you're going to have problems. If everyone's driving EVs, then you might have problems getting access to the charging station. You may have problems with the electricity system, part of which relies on gas and other things to diesel for backup. So that might not be, you might be slightly better off, but particularly if you've got your own solar system. But actually, I think that's not going to be, by the time it gets to this point where you can only drive an EV, I think the problems are going to be much more than just fuel. And that's where we come to, what's happened to food in that time. So if we get to the point where we're just driving EVs and all the fuel has been diverted to distributing food, then you've probably got serious food shortages. You're going to be worried more about where your next meal's coming from than driving to Nan's house. So that's and probably already farmers are already not planting crops because they don't know if they'll be able to, or they can't get diesel or fertilizer at a price that's going to look profitable for them. Yeah. All right. So that this says we're already seeing this. Farmers are already rationing fuel themselves and aren't planting or considering whether to plant because they're not sure if they're going to be able to recoup their costs with these high costs. All right. Then we have service stations. Some have already had shortages, but to be honest, in Australia here, it's not been too bad. But we must remember, they're throwing everything they have at it, so that's something. Also, we're using existing stockpiles. They're running down existing stockpiles. The US has been exporting its stockpiles to keep the price down. So it's kind of like everything's been thrown at this right now, and we'll see what happens when those stockpiles deplete. All right, if fuel becomes difficult to access, then the just-in-time delivery network collapses. Food that is grown and processed may sit at depots because you can't get it to supermarkets. Or even if you can get it, even if you've got trucks going to supermarkets, how do you collect it from all the farms all over the place? How do they get it into the markets? That might be a problem. And currently, under the Emergency Act, agriculture is not considered an essential user. So the National Farmers Federation is urgently lobbying for food supply to be considered a priority under the Act. Definitely, I would agree with them. All right, what's happening already? Even without the Act, 85% of meat producers and abattoirs have only 1 week's worth of diesel supply. Industry groups warn that further disruptions will create shortages and price increases immediately. Farmers have been cut off midweek because big oil companies are tightening supply to secondary wholesalers. And experts are warning that even the price rises we have now could increase food by 50% in price. I mean, if food's going up 50% in price, that's because, well, for one, costs are being passed on, but eventually it'll be because supply and demand. All right. And why has it become supply and demand? Because as the costs get more expensive, farmers reduce planting. Some will take those costs and try and recoup them, and thus the price will go up. Others might say, look, maybe I won't plant at all. All right. Or if they do plant, maybe they can't get things like stock feed. Maybe they can't get their supplies to the market, etc. All right. Okay. So that law comes in, federal law comes into effect if there's a disruption in fuel imports, and if it exceeds 30 days. Well, it turns out we've passed that 30 days. So we're past the technical trigger, but they've been, as I say, throwing everything at it to keep it going. Even if the Strait opens now, we're going to have months of impact. All right, so what are we doing? We're drawing down our reserves. Somehow it says here they've actually increased the supplies of stockpiles, but I guess that's probably just come from someone else's stockpile somewhere else, like the US. All right, we've obviously got long delays in our fuel coming, where we're getting it from Asian refineries, Singapore, South Korea, which probably get it from Russia. Okay, all right. So we could hit a psychological tipping point in June. So what are we in now? May. So another month. All right. If we do get rationing, this is my question, businesses will struggle. How will that impact things like commercial rent payments? All right. So it talks about what the government's doing to try and address that. We've got the ATO offering relief from taxes for a while. We have the Banking Association suggesting they can do temporary payment deferrals or emergency credit release for small businesses, interest-free loans, and extra time to pay your bills. But it's not likely that we're going to get sort of buckets of money given to us like in the COVID. So there's no mention of federal mandates for commercial rent relief or, money being given to cover your rent. Okay, but if, there might be temporary rent reductions if you're trying to rent a property or to keep a tenant if the tenant has the option of moving. I'm talking about commercial property here. All right, so obviously there are retail stores that are going to be maybe more at risk, non-essentials, probably more at risk of this. So give some instructions or some suggestions what to do. Check your insurance, talk to your bank. There's no real way to get out of the rent if you're a commercial business. But it says already we're having B2B payment defaults are at near record highs. 60-day payment arrears in the manufacturing sector are up 9.4%. And the transport sector has seen 7% of businesses close in the past year. The commercial landscape is already stressed. A fuel rationing event would push this stress into outright failure for many. What happens when you default on your commercial rent? All right, so there's a process they have to go through. You can then either pay the outstanding rent or resume payments. Basically, that's it. If you're you can get some temporary relief through safe harbour provisions if you've got a company, whereby you promise to restructure and you get someone to help restructure and you can run while you're insolvent, but that's probably not going to solve the problem. Even if you get interest-free payments, if your business is not trading or hasn't got any customers, you're not going to be taking on, I don't think, interest-free loans because you're just not going to be able to repay them. You don't have any income to repay them, so why would you bother? Force majeure doesn't apply to rent payments, applies more to sort of supply contracts. So you might be able to have you might be able to negotiate reduced rent, or you may have clauses that allow you to get reduced rent under certain conditions. But basically you're going to be stuck with it. All right. So, well, if you can't pay your rent, you're going to default on it, aren't you? And they've, so that, I mean, we've talked about all the options. None of them are going to help a business that hasn't got any customers. All right. So I guess in the worst case, businesses just go bankrupt. And it says, that's right, but that's what could happen. But you don't tend to get big court cases, so traders just disappear a lot of the time. Shops just close up. Maybe they don't go bankrupt. Maybe they just stop trading, pay off their debts, and they're out of the market. But if they do have debts they can't pay or rents that they're locked into, because commercial tenancies are usually, couple of years at least. So you can't just walk away from it. So you've still got to pay that rent. So we're already seeing business failures at record highs following the COVID period. With 25-year peak of insolvencies in the last year, or last financial year. Last financial year, before this crisis. Business-related personal insolvencies, sole traders, 19% up to February, before this crisis. So we've got, high interest rates, the geopolitical fuel spike, and obviously existing underlying problems. All right. So which businesses are going to go first? Road freight. 7.1% of road freight businesses have closed in the past year. 70% of trucking operators say they will not survive beyond 6 months under the current conditions. Small operators with 1 to 2 trucks, 78% failure risk. That's massive. Those guys are going to get wiped out. And that has flow-on effects, of course. They're not buying from other people. They're not delivering things. That's a bad sign. All right. Construction failure rates are 6% above the national average. And manufacturers have a 9.4% increase in failure arrears. All right, farmers are facing a double blow of high diesel costs and a 50% year-on-year hike in fertiliser prices. All right, smaller farms with thin buffers are expected to see a moderate uptick in insolvencies. All right, so obviously, it's going to have dramatic impacts on the economy. If oil hits $150 a barrel, that would be comparable to lockdowns during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the difference is that during COVID, the government had that JobKeeper to keep businesses technically alive. In other words, the government pumped a bunch of money into the economy. I don't think that option's available. I think that horse is bolted. They're in huge debt from printing money. Prices went up dramatically from printing money. If they print money now, like they did then, we're just going to have massive inflation, and it's not going to actually solve any problems. People probably still won't buy things they don't need. And actually those things probably won't be available because they won't be in the shops, they won't be delivered. So, all right. So if a business cannot pay its debts, then we get surcharges for deliveries. That adds to the problem. Trucking companies usually have to pay up front. The ATO is already aggressively collecting outstanding debts from small to medium enterprises. And if a business defaults on a tax payment, then the director becomes personally liable. So the limited liability does not apply for the old ATO. Hey, they get an exemption for that. They'll take your assets. All right. So people, if people see that as a risk, they're just going to cease trading. Okay. They'll probably pay their ATO debt and then leave all their creditors hanging out, short of money. Everyone else misses out. All right. So anyway, so what's like this is most likely many businesses not go bankrupt. They just cease trading or are forced into administration. Will a severe crisis threaten the government itself, the system of government itself? And this is interesting. It says it's already threatening the stability of Australia's political system. But the threat is a crisis of political legitimacy and federal cohesion, not an imminent collapse of the constitutional order. Not yet, anyway. Federal-state relations are fracturing. So we've got a breakdown of cooperative federalism. States are now acting unilaterally. So, like they did in COVID, independent of the federal government. So Western Australia is securing its own fuel stocks independently of the Commonwealth. New South Wales is considering building its own diesel supply rather than relying on Canberra. And the Shadow Attorney General has declared that some states don't have confidence in the Prime Minister and are scrambling to secure their own supplies amid frustration with federal leadership. This patchwork response, as Cash calls it, directly undermines the principle of a unified national action during emergencies. When states begin treating each other as competitors rather than collaborators, the Federation itself becomes strained. Now, layer 2, political legitimacy is eroding. Both coalition and one nation politicians argue the government has lost control and is not up for the job. We're getting record protest votes against the major parties. One nation is surging. And, some voters anyway, blame the government, not for the crisis, not just what's happening overseas. There's a statement here from Senator Andrew Bragg. The Australian public have worked out the Prime Minister. He's not a very competent fellow. So, DeepSeek notes, when this sentiment becomes widespread, it weakens the government's ability to command compliance with unpopular measures like rationing. Layer 3. Decades of policy failure have been exposed. Successive governments have failed for decades to address this. So that's how it's been seen by citizens, not as a natural disaster or an act of war beyond anyone's control, but a failure of government. And the reason? Australia has gone from 8 refineries to just 2 in 15 years. Strategic fuel reserves are stored in America rather than here. And also they're way under what they should be. So, it's Crispin Hull in the Canberra Times. He says, it's no good dismissing one nation voters as ignorant fools who will come back to their senses. When the major parties have demonstrably failed to act on known risks for decades. There's even a video of Albo, before he came into government, complaining about the fact that we didn't have enough fuel reserves and it needed to be fixed. So he actually raised that as, in the opposition. And then when he got into power, never did anything about it. You couldn't make this stuff up. Anyway, all right. The Mad Max warning, what collapse would look like. A major Taiwanese output explicitly titled its coverage, The Real Life Mad Max. Australia's petrol and diesel stocks are about to run out. All right. Okay. Diesel stocks. Okay, so the government might be forced to implement nationwide fuel rationing. Rationing itself would be a stress test. Would the public comply, or would civil disobedience escalate? Well, I think we've seen during COVID that people will comply, but whether that saves us, I don't know. All right. DeepSeek says constitutional collapse is unlikely. The government is still governing. They've had 2 emergency national cabinet meetings. The opposition is playing politics, not revolution. They're calling for fuel tax cuts, demanding more transparency, and maybe they want an election, not an insurrection. Panic buying, not organised resistance, is the problem. They say that the biggest risk is panic buying, not supply failure. But I haven't seen much panic buying, maybe a little bit. But I think that's gone now. They may come back, but it's gone for now. Parliament is sitting, the Senate is debating. So it's saying there's, business is business as usual. But business is business as usual now. Not what happens if things get worse. All right. Okay. And I say, yes, but in a real crisis, constitutional collapse might not be explicit. The government just becomes increasingly irrelevant. Okay, so DeepSeek, the slow fade, how government becomes irrelevant. It says this is already underway. You got to watch the AI. They like to agree with you, but it does give evidence for this. A loss of relevance happens not through any single dramatic event, but through a gradual accretion of unilateral actions that render the Commonwealth peripheral. All right, so the evidence of that. States are building their independent capacities. We talked about that before. WA has purchased its own 4 million litre diesel reserve, and New South Wales is considering the same. WA Energy Minister said they want to take the future into their own hands. WA and New South Wales say they've lost confidence in the Albanese government's abilities to manage this. And Chris Bowen actually concedes that. He says, I welcome the efforts of Western Australia. And he reframes it as the states and the Commonwealth working together, when in fact it's exactly the opposite. That's it. That's the crazy world, clown world we live in, where politicians say one thing and mean another, even in the same sentence. Anyway, So DeepSeek summarises that. The last one is telling. When the federal energy minister's job is to welcome states doing things unilaterally, the federal government has already lost its coordinating role. It's not been overthrown, it's been bypassed. All right, so the COVID parallel is the right comparison, but worse. The pandemic showed how quickly states can go it alone when they lose confidence in federal leadership, border closures, vaccine rollouts, quarantine policies, all state-by-state patchworks. But here's the difference. During COVID, the federal government still had fiscal dominance. In other words, it could print the money. All right, so states closed the borders, but Canberra paid the bills. So it still had a role to play. But that lever is weaker in this circumstance. The ATO is already stretched. In other words, they're struggling to collect the money that they're already owed, presumably because people haven't got it. The budget is constrained. Basically, they've already spent themselves into oblivion, and unless we want to become any more spending, we'll become Venezuela. And you can't replace fuel that's not there. You can try and bribe countries to send it to you by paying a premium. But if you're just printing that money, who's going to take it? All right. So the IPA's Daniel Wyde puts it bluntly, and these are other reasons why people aren't happy with the federal government. We've got massive migration. We've got people with no housing or high housing costs, and we've spent a fortune on infrastructure, but the roads are still full of potholes, and basic things aren't happening. So people's faith in government has basically gone out the window. IPA's Daniel Wyde says maybe this is DeepSeek. Well, it looks like it's quoting Daniel Wyde. This just shows the Federation is completely broken. All right. DeepSeek summary. The founders didn't plan for this constitution. It was written by men who were provincials. They wanted to create a weak federal government and leave most things to the states. They didn't foresee what would happen over the next 150 years. And the Commonwealth became bigger, and its power came from controlling the money and external affairs. Its power came from defence, trade, taxation, currency. That's what gave the federal government its relevance and its influence. But fuel distribution, that's inside Australia. That's intranational logistics. And that power is ambiguous in the Constitution because the founders assumed states would handle their own internal affairs. So even though there is a federal act to sort of try and coordinate the response to this, I guess that could be tackled in court. Maybe it's a federal responsibility to get the fuel to Australia, but not distribute it once it's here. Anyway, but a crisis like this requires coordinated internal action, moving fuel from ports to regions, rationing supply, managing hoarding. The federal government has to rely on cooperation, not command. And when the states stop cooperating, the federal government doesn't collapse, it just becomes irrelevant. When does irrelevance become systemic? States stop sharing information. WA has already revealed that major suppliers store their national stock in Queensland, not Western Australia. This isn't a state hoarding, but a supplier making a decision that leaves a state vulnerable. But once states realise the federal stock holding isn't protecting them, they stop trusting the Commonwealth to enforce it. So in other words, once states start to grab fuel for themselves and other states realise that their fuel is stored in somewhere else, it's going to be a battle between states. All right. The New South Wales Premier said his government is planning for all contingencies, including if they have to go it alone. So the language of competition, not coordination. Bowen's statement that he encouraged state governments to act within their powers is diplomatically phrased, but the subtext is clear. The Commonwealth cannot stop them. It's not a threat to federal supremacy. It's an admission that federal supremacy in this domain does not exist. Federal government doesn't have the power to tell states what to do in this regard. But citizens stop looking to Canberra. That's the third point. Farmers facing fuel shortages blame Canberra. They expect Canberra to fix it, but they start calling their state premier. The federal government has already faded from irrelevance in their lived experience. Yeah, and Already happened. Bottom line, you're describing a functional collapse, not a constitutional one. Will there be a constitutional collapse? Probably not, because the Constitution doesn't require the government to be relevant everywhere. The states have their own constitutions, their own parliaments, their own police forces, their own budgets. All right, the Federation can survive a weak Commonwealth. I mean, it was designed to be weak. All right, but what you're describing, government becoming just increasingly irrelevant, is arguably worse than a dramatic collapse. A constitutional crisis demands resolution, a change of government, a high court case, even a referendum. These events clarify who's in charge. But irrelevance doesn't demand resolution. It just means when the next crisis hits, the next wave of supply disruptions, there's no central authority to coordinate the response. Not because the laws have changed, but because no one bothers to call Canberra anymore. I think this is what we're facing. We're going to be facing basically local state governments, basically states running as independently. I think that's what's going to happen, and maybe eventually even communities running independently if the state government starts to fail to address these things. So we've got I think a devolution of power from the top down. Communities are going to have to be pulling together more and more to solve their problems, and that problems I suspect are going to be ones where there's no or limited fuel supplies to help them, and those fuel supply problems are going to then, I think, trickle into other areas. This is my speculation, whereby communities start doing more and more things for themselves, and governments at the federal and state level become more and more irrelevant. They're not going to be able to do much anyway if they're not getting tax revenue. So, I mean, if your businesses are all failing and you're running a command and control economy, and basically no one's got any money, how are they paying their GST? How are they going to be? And they're not driving their cars. They're not going to be paying their registrations. They're not going to be paying fuel taxes. So governments are going to find they just haven't got funding. They're not going to have funding, and that's going to make them even less effective. So communities are going to be forced to become, more resilient, more local decision making, and ultimately, I think this could lead to a complete restructuring of Australia and how Australia operates. But that's just my opinion. I could talk more about what I think that'll look like, but that's enough. That's enough for now. Thank you.